The November of 1894 shall long be remembered in London for its particularly oppressive fogs, those yellow choking veils that transformed our great metropolis into a labyrinth of muffled sounds and phantom shapes. It was during one such evening, when the very air seemed thick enough to cut with a blade, that I returned to our familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street after a most trying day attending to the ailments of my patients. The persistent dampness had aggravated every rheumatic condition in my practice, and I found myself longing for the warmth of our sitting-room fire and perhaps a restorative pipe in the company of my extraordinary friend. As I climbed the 17 steps to our quarters, the familiar sound of Holmes's violin greeted me through the door. Not the melodious strains of a classical piece, but rather the sharp, discordant notes that invariably accompanied his periods of intellectual restlessness. I had learned, through years of companionship, to recognize these musical outbursts as surely as a physician might diagnose a fever, for they spoke of a mind hungry for stimulation and a spirit chafing against the mundane. "Holmes," I called as I entered, setting my medical bag upon the table with perhaps more emphasis than strictly necessary. "Surely Mrs. Hudson's nerves cannot endure much more of that particular composition." My friend ceased his playing mid-phrase and turned toward me, his keen grey eyes immediately conducting that unsettling inventory of my appearance which never failed to remind me of his extraordinary powers of observation. His tall, angular frame remained poised with the bow still raised, as though he were a conductor frozen in the midst of directing some invisible orchestra. "Watson," said he, lowering the instrument with deliberate care, "you have been treating patients in the Marylebone district, elderly individuals, judging by the particular scent of camphor that clings to your coat. The consultations were largely unsuccessful, given the dejected slope of your shoulders, and you walked considerably through this abominable fog before securing transport, as evidenced by the moisture that has penetrated your trousers to precisely the knee." I stared at him with that familiar mixture of admiration and exasperation that had become my customary expression in his presence. "Your deductions are, as always, remarkably precise, though I confess I cannot fathom how you determined the specific locality." Holmes moved to our window, drawing back the heavy curtain to peer into the grey murk that shrouded Baker Street. "The clay upon your left boot, my dear fellow, bears the distinctive reddish tint found only near the construction work currently proceeding in Wimpole Street. Combined with the other evidence, Marylebone was the inevitable conclusion." Before I could respond to this typical display of his methods, the sharp rap of knuckles against our door interrupted our exchange. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed, immediately carrying an unusual note of urgency that caused Holmes to abandon his position at the window with characteristic swiftness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," came our landlady's call. "There's a lady here to see you, and she's accompanied by Inspector Lestrade. They say it's a matter of the utmost importance." Holmes opened the door with fluid motion, revealing our long-suffering landlady accompanied by two figures whose contrasting states of agitation spoke volumes about the nature of their visit. The first was a lady of evident breeding, her elegant dress and refined bearing marking her as a member of London's upper society, though her pale complexion and trembling hands betrayed considerable distress. Behind her stood the familiar figure of Inspector Lestrade, his sharp features wearing that expression of professional frustration I had come to associate with cases that defied conventional police methods. "Pray enter," said Holmes, gesturing toward our sitting area with a sweep of his arm. "Mrs. Hudson, if you would be so kind as to bring tea, and perhaps something stronger for our guests, as they appear to have endured considerable strain." As our visitors settled themselves before the fire, I took my customary position across from Holmes, noting how his entire demeanor had transformed from languid musician to alert investigator in the space of moments. The lady's distress was palpable, manifesting in the rapid rise and fall of her chest and the way her gloved hands twisted together in her lap. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice carrying the cultured accent of one educated in the finest establishments. "I am Lady Margaret Whitmore of Greystone Manor in Belgravia. I've come to you because Inspector Lestrade has informed me that Scotland Yard considers my case to be beyond the realm of conventional investigation." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his grey eyes bright with the anticipation of intellectual challenge. "Indeed. Pray continue, Lady Whitmore. In my experience, the cases that perplex Scotland Yard often prove to be the most illuminating." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his professional pride evidently stung by this characterization. "Now see here, Mr. Holmes," he interjected, "this isn't a matter of police incompetence. What Lady Whitmore witnessed 3 nights ago defies all rational explanation. I've been investigating crimes for 20 years, and I've never encountered anything like it." Lady Whitmore drew a shuddering breath before launching into her extraordinary account. 3 evenings past, on November 10th. I was hosting a small dinner party at Greystone Manor for several members of Parliament and their wives. Among the guests was Sir Reginald Ashford, the Under-Secretary for Colonial Affairs, a gentleman of impeccable reputation and considerable influence in government circles. She paused to accept the brandy that Mrs. Hudson had quietly provided, her hands trembling slightly as she raised the glass to her lips. The evening had proceeded quite normally until approximately 9:30, when Sir Reginald excused himself from the drawing-room, stating his intention to retrieve a document from his coat in the entrance hall. The distance from our drawing-room to the front hall is perhaps 30 feet, connected by a straight corridor with no branching passages or alcoves. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his attention now completely focused upon our visitor. "You observed Sir Reginald's departure?" "Indeed, Mr. Holmes. As hostess, I naturally noticed when one of my guests left the room. I watched him walk through the doorway and proceed down the corridor toward the entrance hall. The passage is well lit by gas fixtures, and I had a clear view of his progress." Lady Whitmore set down her glass, with a hand that shook visibly. "But then, Mr. Holmes, the impossible occurred. I saw Sir Reginald take perhaps 6 or 7 steps down the corridor. He was moving at a normal pace, neither hurried nor hesitant. And then, in the space between one footstep and the next, he simply vanished. One moment he was there, solid and real as you or I, walking purposefully toward the hall, and the next moment the corridor was empty, as though he had never existed at all." The silence that followed this declaration was profound, broken only by the crackling of our fire and the muffled sounds of London's fog-shrouded streets. Holmes remained perfectly still, his piercing gaze fixed upon Lady Whitmore's face with an intensity that seemed to strip away all possibility of deception or delusion. "You are quite certain of what you observed?" Holmes asked finally, his voice carrying that peculiar gentleness he reserved for moments of genuine gravity. "As certain as I am of my own existence, Mr. Holmes. The other guests noticed Sir Reginald's absence within minutes, and we immediately searched the entire manor. Every room, every closet, every possible hiding place was examined. The front door remained locked from the inside, the windows were secure, and there are no secret passages or hidden compartments in that corridor. Sir Reginald Ashford had simply ceased to exist." Lestrade cleared his throat and leaned forward in his chair. "I was summoned the following morning when Sir Reginald failed to return to his own residence. My men and I have conducted the most thorough investigation possible. We've interviewed every guest, every servant, examined every inch of the manor and its grounds. There is no rational explanation for what occurred." Holmes rose from his chair and began the familiar pacing that indicated his mind was already working upon the problem with characteristic intensity. "Tell me, Inspector, what measures were taken immediately following Sir Reginald's disappearance? Were the guests permitted to leave?" "The guests remained until nearly midnight while we searched the house," Lestrade replied. "Lady Whitmore was most cooperative in allowing us complete access to the property. We found no trace of Sir Reginald, no signs of struggle, no indication that he had ever reached the entrance hall." "And Sir Reginald's background?" Holmes continued his pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Any enemies? Any recent troubles? Any reason why someone might wish him harm?" Lady Whitmore shook her head emphatically. Sir Reginald was universally respected, Mr. Holmes. His work at the Colonial Office was exemplary, and he had no known enemies. He was a widower of 3 years, with no immediate family save a nephew who resides in India. Holmes paused in his pacing and fixed our visitors with that penetrating stare that had unnerved countless criminals and witnesses alike. Lady Whitmore, I must ask you to recall the evening with the utmost precision. Was there anything unusual about Sir Reginald's behavior during dinner? Any conversation that might have disturbed him? Any indication that he was expecting to meet someone? Nothing whatsoever, Mr. Holmes. He was his usual charming self, discussing parliamentary matters with Lord Pemberton and complimenting Mrs. Harrington on her recent charitable work. He appeared entirely at ease until the moment he excused himself. Holmes moved to the window once more, staring out into the fog-shrouded street as though seeking inspiration from the yellow murk that enveloped London. When he turned back to face us, his expression had taken on that look of intense concentration I had learned to associate with the commencement of his most challenging cases. "Inspector Lestrade," he said finally, "you have done admirably within the constraints of conventional investigation. However, as you yourself have observed, this case appears to transcend conventional boundaries. Lady Whitmore, I shall require access to Greystone Manor and permission to conduct my own examination of the premises." Lady Whitmore rose from her chair with visible relief. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Anything you require. I confess I have been unable to sleep properly since that dreadful evening, and the servants are beginning to whisper of supernatural forces." Holmes reached for his long grey ulster, and I saw that familiar gleam in his eyes that spoke of the hunt begun and the scent well struck. "Watson, your coat and medical bag, if you please. I suspect we shall have need of both your observational skills and your medical expertise before this matter is resolved." As I gathered my belongings, I heard Holmes murmur, half to himself, "If a man can disappear between 2 steps, Watson, it is either because he was never taking those steps at all, or because there were more steps than the world perceived. Come, gentlemen and Lady Whitmore, let us see what secrets Greystone Manor has concealed within its walls." The fog seemed to part before us as we descended to the street, and I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation that marked the beginning of another of Holmes's extraordinary investigations. Whatever rational explanation lay behind Sir Reginald Ashford's impossible vanishing, I was certain that my remarkable friend would uncover it, no matter how deeply it might be buried in deception and misdirection. The hansom cab lurched through London's fog-choked streets, our progress marked by the muffled clip of hooves on wet cobblestones and the occasional spectral glow of gas lamps emerging from the yellow murk. Lady Whitmore sat rigidly across from us, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Inspector Lestrade consulted his pocket watch with the air of a man who had exhausted conventional solutions. Holmes remained characteristically absorbed, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated as we passed beneath the wavering streetlights. "Inspector," Holmes remarked suddenly, his eyes still fixed upon the swirling fog beyond our window, "I observe that you have recently changed your tobacco blend. The aroma clinging to your coat suggests a mixture with a higher proportion of Virginia leaf than your customary preference." Lestrade started visibly. "Good heavens, Holmes, how could you possibly—" "The scent is quite distinct from our previous encounters, and the slight discoloration on your right thumb indicates a tobacco that burns somewhat hotter than your usual brand. A gift, perhaps, from a colleague." Holmes's grey eyes glinted with that familiar spark of intellectual satisfaction. "My sergeant's retirement present," Lestrade admitted grudgingly. "But what bearing has this upon Sir Reginald's disappearance?" "None whatsoever," Holmes replied with a slight smile. "Merely confirmation that observation and deduction remain reliable even when confronting the apparently impossible." Greystone Manor materialized from the fog like something from a Gothic romance, its imposing Georgian facade rising 4 stories above manicured grounds. Gas lamps flanked the entrance drive, their flames dancing behind glass shields that did little to penetrate the oppressive atmosphere. The building itself spoke of wealth accumulated over generations, its classical proportions and elegant stonework marking it as one of Belgravia's finest residences. Lady Whitmore led us directly to the scene of the impossible vanishing. The corridor stretched before us exactly as she had described. 30 feet of straight passage connecting the drawing room to the entrance hall, with no alcoves, intersecting passages, or possible means of concealment. Gas fixtures mounted at regular intervals cast steady light upon polished oak paneling and a thick Axminster runner of deep blue. Holmes immediately dropped to one knee, producing his magnifying glass to examine the carpet with methodical precision. He progressed slowly along the exact path Sir Reginald had taken, pausing frequently to study particular sections with extraordinary care. His movements were those of a surgeon conducting a delicate operation, each gesture deliberate and purposeful. "Lady Whitmore," he said without looking up, "you mentioned recent work in the house. What manner of repairs or improvements?" "The gas fittings were serviced last month," she replied, "and the paneling was cleaned just last week by Miggins and Son." Holmes spent considerable time examining the area where Lady Whitmore had last seen Sir Reginald, his lens moving over every inch of carpet and baseboard. He then produced a small measuring tape, recording precise distances in his notebook. When he reached beneath the carpet's edge near the wall, his expression sharpened with interest. "Watson, observe this section of flooring," he said, lifting the runner's corner. "Note the slight variation in the wood grain here, and the almost imperceptible gap along this board." I knelt beside him, studying the area he indicated. To my untrained eye, the floorboards appeared uniform, but Holmes's finger traced what might have been the faintest of seams. "Recent work indeed," Holmes murmured, rising to examine the gas fixture directly above. He tested its mounting with gentle pressure, then ran his fingers along the wall's surface. "Inspector, your men found nothing beneath this carpet during their search?" "Nothing but solid oak flooring, Mr. Holmes. We examined every inch." Holmes moved to the entrance hall where he conducted an equally thorough inspection of Sir Reginald's coat hanging in the cloakroom. From one pocket, he extracted a torn envelope bearing foreign postmarks, its corner ripped as though opened in haste. "Sir Reginald intended to retrieve a document," Holmes observed, studying the envelope's remnants. "Yet no such paper was found among his effects." "None," confirmed Lestrade. "The coat contained only his usual items: wallet, watch, handkerchief." Holmes returned to the corridor, standing precisely where Lady Whitmore had witnessed the disappearance. His grey eyes swept the passage with that peculiar intensity I had observed countless times, as though he were reading some invisible text written upon the very air. "The impossible, Watson, is merely the improbable wearing a more dramatic costume," he said finally. "Sir Reginald Ashford did not vanish into thin air. He simply travelled farther than this corridor was designed to reveal." With that cryptic observation, Holmes strode toward the entrance, leaving Lestrade and myself to exchange bewildered glances. Whatever solution my remarkable friend had begun to perceive, it remained tantalizingly beyond the reach of ordinary minds. Holmes's examination of Greystone Manor resumed at first light, though the November fog showed little inclination to lift from London streets. I found my friend already deep in conversation with Lady Whitmore's butler, Mr. Keene, a dignified gentleman whose spare frame and measured speech marked him as a servant of the old school. The household staff had been assembled in the entrance hall, their faces reflecting that peculiar mixture of curiosity and apprehension that accompanies any disruption to domestic routine. On the evening in question, Holmes began, his grey eyes moving systematically from one face to another, were the corridor gas lamps burning at their customary level. The footman, Thomas, shifted uncomfortably before responding. "Higher than usual, sir. Her ladyship always prefers the passages well lit when entertaining guests of importance." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And did you observe any irregularities in their operation? Flickering, perhaps, or variations in pressure?" "There were moments, sir," Thomas admitted, glancing nervously at the butler, when the flame seemed to waver, like there was a draught somewhere. I thought it peculiar, given how still the air usually is in that corridor. Most observant, Holmes murmured, producing his notebook. And this wavering occurred where, precisely? Thomas indicated a point approximately halfway down the corridor, near where Sir Reginald had vanished. Holmes made a careful notation before turning his attention to the housemaid Ellen, whose nervous fidgeting suggested she possessed information of potential significance. "You mentioned cleaning the brass fixtures recently," Holmes continued. "When exactly did this occur?" "Thursday morning, sir, the day before the dinner party. I always polish them before entertaining, but this time I had to go over them twice on account of the dust from Miggins & Son's work." Holmes's interest sharpened perceptibly. "What manner of work were they performing?" "Cleaning the oak panelling with some chemical solution, sir. It had a sharp smell to it, like vinegar, but stronger. They said it would remove old stains and brighten the wood grain." "Oxalic acid," Holmes observed quietly, more to himself than to the assembled staff. "A powerful bleaching agent, though it requires considerable skill to apply without damaging the wood's natural pattern." He moved to the corridor, kneeling once again to examine the paneling with his magnifying glass. This time, however, his attention focused on areas where the wood grain appeared subtly different from its surroundings, as though certain sections had been treated more heavily than others. "Mr. Keene," he said without looking up, "I assume you supervised this cleaning work personally." "Indeed, sir. Miggins & Son came highly recommended, though I confess their methods seemed rather intensive for simple cleaning." Holmes rose, his expression thoughtful. "And the outer doors remained secure throughout the evening?" "Absolutely, sir. I personally checked every lock before retiring." Before Holmes could continue his questioning, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the entrance, announcing the arrival of an unexpected visitor. The gentleman who entered bore the unmistakable bearing of government service, his unremarkable features and careful dress marking him as one accustomed to conducting business in the shadows of Whitehall. "Mr. Holmes," he said with quiet authority, "I am Mr. Thornfield from the Colonial Office. I believe you are investigating Sir Reginald Ashford's disappearance." Holmes dismissed the servants with a gesture, though I noticed his eyes remained fixed upon the corridor as though memorizing every detail. "Indeed, Mr. Thornfield, though I confess surprise that a simple vanishing has attracted attention from such elevated circles." Thornfield settled himself carefully in the drawing-room, his movements betraying the diplomatic precision of one accustomed to delicate negotiations. "Sir Reginald was handling matters of considerable sensitivity when he disappeared. Documents have gone missing from his office, territorial surveys relating to mineral rights in the Sudan, information that could prove extremely valuable to foreign interests." The revelation cast an entirely new light upon the evening's events. Holmes began his characteristic pacing, his sharp profile reflecting the rapid calculations occurring within that extraordinary mind. "You suspect Sir Reginald of selling these documents?" Holmes asked bluntly. Thornfield's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "We had been monitoring his activities for several weeks. His financial circumstances had become pressing. Gambling debts, expensive habits, the burden of maintaining his late wife's social commitments on a civil servant's salary." Holmes paused in his pacing to fix our visitor with that penetrating stare that had unnerved countless subjects. "And the evening of his disappearance? He had discovered that certain papers were missing from his office only hours before attending Lady Whitmore's dinner party. He was considerably agitated by the discovery, though we now suspect he may have orchestrated the theft himself." Holmes returned to the corridor, this time producing a small folding rule to measure the precise spacing between gas fixtures. At one point, his measurements revealed a discrepancy, a gap of 25 inches rather than the uniform 24 found elsewhere. "Recent modifications," he murmured, working his penknife beneath the carpet's edge to reveal fresh varnish upon the floorboards. "Someone has labored considerably to make new work appear old, though they could not entirely disguise the evidence." He moved to examine Sir Reginald's coat in the cloakroom, from which he extracted fragments of a torn envelope bearing foreign postmarks. "Berlin," he observed, studying the remnants, "and the paper shows signs of hasty opening, as though the recipient feared discovery." Returning to the corridor, Holmes stood precisely where Lady Whitmore had witnessed the impossible disappearance. His grey eyes swept the passage with that peculiar intensity I had observed countless times, as though he were reading some invisible text written upon the very architecture itself. "The impossible, Watson," he said finally, "is merely the improbable wearing theatrical costume. Sir Reginald Ashford did not vanish into thin air. He simply travelled farther than this corridor was designed to reveal. The question now becomes whether he accomplished this feat through his own desperation or with assistance from those who had purchased his services." With that cryptic observation, Holmes requested complete building plans of Greystone Manor and the immediate address of Miggins and Son. Whatever solution my remarkable friend had begun to perceive remained tantalizingly beyond ordinary comprehension, though I sensed we stood upon the threshold of revelations that would illuminate not merely Sir Reginald's fate, but the intricate web of deception that had made his impossible vanishing appear so convincingly supernatural. The building plans of Greystone Manor arrived by special messenger within the hour, their crisp vellum crackling as Holmes spread them across Lady Whitmore's mahogany writing desk. His grey eyes moved systematically across the architectural drawings, his long fingers tracing the corridor's dimensions with mathematical precision. After several minutes of intense study, he straightened with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe these measurements. The corridor from drawing room to entrance hall measures 30 feet according to our hostess's description, yet these original plans indicate 29 feet and 3 inches. Someone has added 9 inches to a passage without extending the walls." Before I could voice my bewilderment at this apparent impossibility, Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "Come, my dear fellow. I believe a visit to Miggins and Son will prove most illuminating." The workshop of Miggins and Son occupied a narrow building in Southwark, its grimy windows and weathered sign speaking of honest labor rather than prosperity. The interior reeked of sawdust, varnish, and that sharp chemical odor Ellen had described. Mr. Miggins himself emerged from the depths of the establishment, a barrel-chested man with calloused hands and intelligent eyes that grew wary upon recognizing Holmes's card. "Greystone Manor," Holmes began without preamble, his tone deceptively casual. "You completed restoration work there last week, I believe. Oxalic acid treatment of the oak paneling?" Miggins nodded slowly. "Aye, sir. Stubborn stains required strong measures. Her ladyship was particular about the results." Holmes moved through the workshop with apparent idleness, though I recognized the predatory grace that marked his most intense investigations. His attention settled upon a collection of brass fittings, counterweights, and what appeared to be sections of finely crafted mahogany panels stacked against the far wall. "Curious. Materials for a cleaning establishment," Holmes observed, producing his magnifying glass to examine the brass components. "These appear to be precision-engineered pulleys, designed for considerable weight distribution." Miggins's composure cracked visibly. Those were for another commission, sir. Nothing to do with Greystone Manor." "Indeed." Holmes's voice carried that silky tone I'd learned to associate with impending revelation. "Yet this mahogany bears the distinctive grain pattern I observed in Lady Whitmore's corridor, and these brass fittings show fresh installation marks consistent with recent mounting." The craftsman's shoulders sagged in defeat. "I was hired to install a concealed compartment, sir, behind the paneling in that corridor. The gentleman said it was for storing important papers, perfectly legitimate. He paid handsomely and seemed to know the house's construction intimately." Holmes leaned forward with sharp interest. "Describe this gentleman." "Tall, thin, wore spectacles," Miggins replied reluctantly. "Spoke precise English, but with a slight accent. German, perhaps. Called himself Mr. Lang. Said he was an architect working on improvements for her ladyship. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me before continuing his examination of the workshop. In a drawer partially concealed beneath wood shavings, he discovered detailed sketches of Greystone Manor's corridor, complete with measurements and mechanical specifications that spoke of meticulous planning. This compartment, Holmes pressed, was it designed merely for storage? Miggins shook his head miserably. More complex than that, sir. The gentleman wanted a mechanism that could conceal a person temporarily. Said it was for theatrical purposes, some sort of parlor entertainment. I thought it peculiar, but the payment was generous. Holmes studied the sketches with intense concentration, his analytical mind clearly processing the mechanical implications. And the installation was completed when? Thursday morning, sir. The day before her ladyship's dinner party. We tested the mechanism thoroughly, worked smooth as silk. As we departed the workshop, Holmes maintained thoughtful silence until we reached the street. Inspector Lestrade, who had spent the morning pursuing conventional leads among the household staff, joined us with the frustrated expression of a man whose theories had proven fruitless. "The servants know nothing useful," he reported, "though I maintain that someone in that house must have assisted in Sir Reginald's disappearance. A man cannot simply vanish without inside help." Holmes smiled enigmatically. "Cannot he, Inspector? I believe Mr. Miggins would disagree with that assessment." Rather than elaborate, Holmes requested that Lestrade post discreet surveillance on the workshop while maintaining absolute secrecy about our discoveries. "The mechanism exists, Inspector, but its purpose extends beyond simple concealment. Someone invested considerable effort and expense in creating this illusion, and I suspect they are not finished with their work." As evening fog began to settle over London's streets, Holmes outlined his strategy with characteristic precision. "Tonight, Watson, we shall return to Greystone Manor as Lady Whitmore's guests. The trap has been set, but the prey has not yet taken the bait. Before this affair concludes, someone must return to that corridor, either to retrieve what they have hidden or to eliminate evidence of their deception." He paused at the entrance to 221B Baker Street, his sharp profile etched against the gaslight. "Bring your service revolver, my dear fellow. I suspect we shall have need of it before dawn." The game, as Holmes would say, was indeed afoot, though the true nature of our quarry remained tantalizingly concealed behind layers of mechanical ingenuity and international intrigue. The fog had thickened to an almost palpable presence as we returned to Greystone Manor under cover of darkness. Holmes had insisted upon this nocturnal vigil, convinced that whoever had orchestrated Sir Reginald's disappearance would return to complete their work. Lady Whitmore received us with nervous gratitude, her household staff dismissed to their quarters save for the essential few who remained under Lestrade's discreet supervision. Holmes moved through the corridor with the precision of a surgeon, his keen eyes examining every detail revealed by our afternoon's discoveries. From his coat, he produced a small vial of fine powder, which he sprinkled along the carpet in an almost invisible line extending from the drawing-room entrance to the precise spot where Sir Reginald had vanished. "French chalk," he murmured to me as he worked. "Invisible to the casual observer, yet it will record the slightest pressure from a footstep or the movement of concealed machinery." Next, he adjusted the third gas fixture with delicate precision, his long fingers manipulating the brass, mounting until it clicked softly into a new position. The flame flickered momentarily before resuming its steady glow, though I noticed the light now cast slightly different shadows along the paneling. "The mechanism Miggins described operates on a combination of gas pressure and counterweight systems," Holmes explained quietly. "By adjusting this fixture to a specific setting, we create the conditions necessary for the hidden panel to function. Our mysterious Mr. Lang designed his trap well, but he could not anticipate that his own creation might be turned against him." Lestrade positioned himself in the entrance hall while Holmes and I took up stations in the drawing-room, from which we commanded a clear view of the corridor. The inspector's 2 constables remained concealed in the rear garden, ready to intercept anyone attempting to flee through the grounds. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. The grandfather clock in the hall marked each quarter hour with sonorous chimes that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Holmes remained motionless in his chair, though I could sense the coiled tension in his frame, like a predator awaiting the perfect moment to strike. Near midnight, the faintest of sounds reached our ears, a soft scraping as though metal were sliding against metal somewhere within the walls themselves. Holmes raised his hand in warning, his gray eyes fixed upon the corridor with laser-like intensity. The 3rd gas fixture began to turn, rotating slowly until its flame dimmed to barely a whisper. In response, a section of the oak paneling, invisible until that moment, shifted inward with mechanical precision. The hidden compartment that Miggins had constructed revealed itself as a masterpiece of concealed engineering, its edges so perfectly fitted that they left no trace when closed. A figure emerged from the entrance hall, moving with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the house's layout. Thomas, the young footman, crept toward the opened panel with obvious nervousness, a small dark lantern clutched in his trembling hands. His feet disturbed the chalk powder, leaving clear evidence of his passage. Holmes sprang into action with the fluid grace that marked his most decisive moments. "Thomas," he said quietly, stepping into the corridor, "I believe you have something that belongs to the Crown." The young man spun around with a gasp of terror, his lantern clattering to the floor. "Mr. Holmes, I was only retrieving the documents that Sir Reginald concealed within that compartment 3 nights ago," Holmes finished smoothly. "The same documents that your mysterious employer believes were destroyed in his staged disappearance." Lestrade appeared from the entrance hall, his heavy footsteps announcing the end of Thomas's hopes for escape. The footman sagged against the wall, his face pale with defeat. "He told me it would be simple," Thomas whispered. "Just retrieve a packet and leave it by the garden gate. Said no one would be harmed, that it was merely a matter of business." Holmes knelt beside the opened panel, his hands exploring its interior with practiced skill. From a concealed recess, he extracted a leather portfolio, its contents rustling with the sound of important papers. "The Nubian Territorial Surveys," he announced with satisfaction, "complete with mineral rights documentation and strategic assessments. Quite valuable to certain foreign interests, I should imagine." Before Thomas could respond, the sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the night air. The drawing-room window exploded inward, showering us with fragments of glass. Holmes threw himself sideways, dragging the terrified footman with him as a second bullet buried itself in the oak paneling where they had stood moments before. "Our Mr. Lang grows impatient," Holmes observed with grim amusement, brushing glass from his coat. "Lestrade, your men in the garden, quickly now. Our sniper cannot have gone far in this fog." As the inspector rushed to coordinate the pursuit, Holmes examined the hidden mechanism one final time before triggering its closure. The panel slid shut with the same silent precision, once again becoming invisible within the corridor's elegant paneling. "The trap is sprung, Watson," he said quietly, "but I fear we have caught only the smaller fish. The true architect of this deception remains at large, and I suspect his desperation will make him far more dangerous than a mere footman seeking easy coin." The game, as Holmes would say, had indeed taken a decidedly perilous turn. The constables returned from their pursuit through London's fog-shrouded streets with faces bearing the frustration of men who had chased shadows through a labyrinth of yellow murk. Lestrade dispatched them immediately to rouse the nearest beat offices and canvass the surrounding mews, while Holmes knelt beside the shattered drawing-room window to examine the evidence left by our mysterious marksman. From the splintered oak paneling, he extracted 2 rifle bullets with the precision of a surgeon, holding each to the gaslight for careful examination. The metallic gleam revealed details that spoke volumes to his trained eye. "Cupro-nickel jacket, smokeless powder propellant," he murmured, producing his magnifying glass for closer inspection. Continental manufacture, I should venture. German or Austrian. Note the distinctive rifling marks, Watson. Our shooter employs military-grade ammunition, though the weapon itself shows signs of considerable wear and perhaps amateur modification. He moved to the window, calculating angles with mathematical precision. The trajectory suggests a position in the elm tree beyond the garden wall, an excellent vantage point requiring both considerable skill and intimate knowledge of the property's layout. Our Mr. Lang proves himself a man of diverse and dangerous talents. Thomas remained under guard in the library, his earlier terror having settled into a sullen resignation that made him more forthcoming with details. Holmes positioned himself across from the young footman, his grey eyes conducting that penetrating examination which had unnerved countless subjects over the years. "You will answer with absolute precision," Holmes began, his tone deceptively gentle. "Your life may well depend upon the accuracy of your recollection. This Mr. Lang, describe every detail of your encounters with him." Thomas closed his eyes, clearly struggling to recall specifics through his fear. "He first approached me outside the mews by St. George's Church, sir. Said he'd been observing me for weeks, noted my discretion and reliability, offered me a half-sovereign merely to carry messages. To the telegraph office, to a coffee house in Holborn. The establishment had a name. Europa, sir. Foreign clientele, they said. He would sit in the back room, always behind a curtain. I never saw his face clearly. Tall and thin, spectacles with wire frames, spoke perfect English but held himself like a foreigner. Called himself Mr. Lang, claimed to be researching domestic service in great houses for some scholarly work." Holmes leaned forward with sharp interest. "And his instructions regarding the evening of Sir Reginald's disappearance?" "He said Sir Reginald would be leaving something in a particular location. He gave me precise directions to find it. Said I was to wait exactly 2 hours after Sir Reginald left the drawing room, then retrieve whatever packet I found and leave it by the garden gate. Told me it was all arranged with Sir Reginald himself, some matter of avoiding his creditors." Before Holmes could continue his interrogation, a commotion in the entrance hall announced the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Mr. Thornfield from the Colonial Office entered with obvious agitation, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of hasty dressing. Most curious of all, I observed a faint discoloration along his left cuff, a pale streak as though some powerful chemical had bleached the fabric. "Mr. Holmes," Thornfield said breathlessly, "I came as soon as I received word of the shooting. Are the documents secure?" Holmes's eyes fixed upon that telltale stain with laser-like intensity. "Quite secure, Mr. Thornfield, though I confess curiosity about your evident haste. That mark upon your sleeve, oxalic acid, perhaps, the same substance used by Miggins and Son in their recent work here." Thornfield's face paled visibly as he attempted to conceal the stained cuff within his coat. I've been conducting my own investigation into this matter. Visited the workshop this morning to examine their methods." "Indeed." Holmes's voice carried that silky tone I'd learned to associate with impending revelation. "And what did you discover during this investigation?" Before Thornfield could respond, a constable burst through the door with news that sent a chill through the assembled company. "Inspector Lestrade, sir. Message from Southwark. The carpenter Miggins has been found unconscious in his workshop, overcome by gas fumes. He's alive, sir, but barely conscious and speaking of men who threatened him." Holmes sprang into action with characteristic energy. "Watson, your medical bag. Inspector, we depart for Southwark immediately. Mr. Thornfield, you will accompany us. I believe your expertise may prove invaluable." The workshop of Miggins and Son presented a scene of carefully staged accident. Gas lamps burned at full intensity, filling the confined space with dangerous fumes, while Miggins himself lay sprawled beside his workbench in apparent unconsciousness. My medical examination revealed the classic signs of gas poisoning, though his pulse remained strong enough to suggest intervention had come in time. Holmes moved through the workshop with that predatory grace which marked his most intense investigations. His attention settled immediately upon evidence of hasty departure: overturned tools, scattered wood shavings, and most significantly, a window forced from the outside with sufficient violence to splinter the frame. "Observe, Watson," he said, kneeling beside a distinctive boot print on the window sill. "Continental manufacture again, narrow sole with that characteristic half-moon cut at the heel. The same individual who fired upon us at Greystone Manor." From a drawer partially concealed beneath wood shavings, Holmes extracted detailed sketches of the manor's corridor, complete with mechanical specifications that spoke of meticulous planning. More disturbing still, he discovered correspondence bearing German postmarks and references to the Ashford Commission and final arrangements for the subject's relocation. As Miggins began to regain consciousness under my medical attention, his first coherent words confirmed our worst suspicions. "They came back," he whispered hoarsely. "Said the job wasn't finished. Wanted to know about other passages in the house. Threatened to kill me if I spoke to anyone." Holmes knelt beside the craftsman with uncharacteristic gentleness. "These other passages, Mr. Miggins? What did you tell them?" "Nothing, sir," Miggins replied weakly. "But they had drawings. Old building plans showing tunnels that were sealed decades ago. They knew things about that house that even I didn't know." Holmes rose with an expression of grim satisfaction, though I detected an underlying current of urgency in his manner. The game was indeed accelerating beyond our initial calculations, and I sensed that whatever forces we had set in motion were now driving toward a conclusion that might prove more dangerous than any of us had anticipated. "The trap is sprung, Watson," he said quietly as we prepared to depart. "But I fear we have caught only the smaller fish while the true predators circle in deeper waters. Tomorrow we must cast our nets wider and pray that we are not ourselves caught in the web we seek to unravel." Dawn broke gray and sullen over Baker Street, though Holmes had clearly not slept. I found him in our sitting room surrounded by chemical apparatus, his long fingers staining glass slides with various solutions, while architectural drawings of Greystone Manor lay scattered across every available surface. The sharp tang of developing chemicals mingled with tobacco smoke, creating an atmosphere that spoke of intense intellectual activity sustained through the night hours. "Watson," he said without looking up from his microscope, "observe these fiber samples recovered from the hidden compartment. Note the distinctive weave pattern and the presence of continental wool processing, German manufacture, unless I am much mistaken." He straightened, producing a small vial of purple solution whose fumes made my eyes water. Aniline dye, combined with ferroprussiate of potash. One application to any surface touched by human hands, followed by a spray of diluted acid, will reveal fingerprints with remarkable clarity. Our mysterious Mr. Lang may be skilled in deception, but he cannot avoid leaving traces of his passage. Before I could comment upon this chemical innovation, Holmes had moved to examine the architectural plans with renewed intensity. His finger traced lines across the yellowed parchment, pausing at specific intersections with the precision of a mathematician solving complex equations. The original building plans reveal something far more significant than Miggins's hidden compartment, he announced, his gray eyes bright with discovery. Greystone Manor was constructed upon the foundation of an earlier structure, one that included access to a network of service tunnels connecting the great houses of Belgravia. These passages were sealed during renovations in the 1860s, but the basic infrastructure remains intact. He produced his magnifying glass to examine minute details in the architectural drawings. Note those chalk marks along the tunnel routes, recent additions, judging by their clarity. Someone has been mapping these forgotten passages with considerable care, preparing for operations that require absolute secrecy and multiple escape routes. Inspector Lestrade arrived as Holmes was preparing his chemical solutions for transport, the inspector's haggard appearance suggesting another sleepless night pursuing conventional leads. He accepted Mrs. Hudson's tea with visible gratitude, while Holmes outlined the discoveries that had emerged from our nocturnal investigation. Underground passages, Lestrade repeated slowly, his professional skepticism warring with respect for Holmes's methods. "You're suggesting Sir Reginald was spirited away through some sort of tunnel system?" "Not spirited, Inspector. Extracted according to a carefully orchestrated plan that required intimate knowledge of London's hidden infrastructure." Holmes sealed his chemical preparations in a leather satchel with the care of a surgeon preparing his instruments. The mechanical disappearance was theatrical misdirection, designed to suggest supernatural impossibility while concealing a very human extraction operation. Before Lestrade could respond, Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Mr. Thornfield, whose appearance had undergone a subtle transformation since our previous encounter. His usually immaculate dress showed signs of hasty preparation, and I observed a slight tremor in his hands as he accepted our hospitality. "Mr. Holmes," Thornfield began with obvious reluctance, "I fear I have not been entirely forthcoming about the Colonial Office's interest in Sir Reginald's case. The situation involves matters of considerably greater complexity than simple document theft." Holmes settled into his chair with that predatory stillness which marked his most intense interrogations. "Indeed, Mr. Thornfield, perhaps you would care to elaborate upon these complexities." Thornfield drew a shuddering breath before launching into revelations that cast our entire investigation in a new and sinister light. Sir Reginald Ashford was not merely suspected of selling documents, he had been actively collaborating with German intelligence for nearly 6 months. We allowed this collaboration to continue under surveillance, hoping to identify and capture the entire network. Holmes leaned forward with sharp interest. "A dangerous game, Mr. Thornfield, and one that appears to have gone badly awry. The network is led by an individual known only as Der Schatten, the Shadow, a master of disguise and deception who has been recruiting vulnerable British officials across multiple government departments. Sir Reginald's gambling debts made him an ideal target for recruitment." Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing, his analytical mind clearly processing these revelations with mathematical precision. The vanishing at Greystone Manor was therefore a staged extraction designed to remove Sir Reginald from surveillance while maintaining the illusion of supernatural mystery. "Precisely," Thornfield confirmed. "We believed a Shatton intended to transport Sir Reginald to the continent, where he could continue providing intelligence under a new identity. However, something went wrong with their plan." "The rifle shots at Greystone Manor," Holmes observed grimly. De Shatton discovered that his operation had been compromised and moved to eliminate loose ends, beginning with Sir Reginald himself. Thornfield nodded miserably. "We fear Sir Reginald may already be dead, killed to prevent him from revealing critical information about the network's operations." Holmes paused in his pacing to examine the architectural plans once more, his finger tracing the tunnel routes with renewed understanding. "Not necessarily, Mr. Thornfield. A man of Der Schatten's sophistication would not waste such a valuable asset without extracting every possible advantage. Sir Reginald remains useful as long as he possesses information about British colonial planning." He moved to our window, staring out into the fog-shrouded street with that peculiar intensity I had observed countless times. "The attack on Miggins suggests desperation rather than methodical planning. De Schatten knows we are close to uncovering his operations, but he cannot abandon his prize without completing the extraction." Holmes turned back to face us with an expression of grim determination. "Gentlemen, we are no longer investigating a simple disappearance. We are hunting a master spy who possesses intimate knowledge of London's hidden geography and considerable resources for eliminating obstacles to his success." He gathered his chemical apparatus and the architectural plans with characteristic efficiency. "Inspector, I require complete surveillance of the Europa Coffee House and discreet observation of all entrances to the tunnel system we have identified. Mr. Thornfield, you will provide me with every detail of Sir Reginald's collaboration, no matter how seemingly insignificant." As we prepared to depart for our return to Greystone Manor, Holmes paused at the door with that enigmatic smile I had learned to associate with his most audacious schemes. "The game has indeed taken a perilous turn, Watson," he said quietly. But Der Schatten has made one critical error in his calculations. He has assumed that his theatrical misdirection would prevent us from discovering the mechanical reality beneath his illusions. Tonight, we shall demonstrate that even the most sophisticated deception cannot withstand methodical investigation guided by scientific principles. The fog seemed to part before us as we descended to the street, and I felt that familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension that marked the approach of Holmes's most dangerous confrontations. Whatever forces we had set in motion were now driving toward a conclusion that would test not only my friend's extraordinary abilities, but our very survival against an opponent whose ruthlessness matched his intelligence. The afternoon found us once again within the walls of Greystone Manor, though this time our investigation proceeded with the methodical precision of a surgical operation. Holmes had transformed Lady Whitmore's drawing room into a makeshift laboratory, his chemical apparatus arranged with characteristic care upon her mahogany writing desk. The architectural plans covered every available surface, weighted down with brass ornaments and marked with his distinctive red ink notations. "The tunnel entrance," Holmes announced, applying his aniline solution to a section of the corridor's oak paneling, "must be concealed within 20 feet of the mechanical compartment." Der Schatten's operation required rapid transition from theatrical disappearance to actual extraction, allowing no time for extended movement through the house. The chemical treatment revealed what conventional examination had missed: faint but unmistakable fingerprints along the baseboard, concentrated near a section where the wood grain appeared subtly different from its surroundings. Holmes knelt with his magnifying glass, his keen eyes tracing patterns invisible to ordinary observation. "Watson, observe this junction between floor and wall," he said, working his penknife beneath the baseboard with delicate precision. "Note how the wood yields slightly, as though mounted on hinges rather than permanently fixed." With careful pressure applied at precisely the correct angle, a section of the baseboard swung inward to reveal a narrow opening that descended into absolute darkness. The musty odor of long-sealed spaces emerged from the hidden passage, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of recent human occupation, lamp oil, tobacco, and something else that made my medical training prickle with unease. Holmes produced his electric torch and directed its beam into the concealed tunnel. "The original service tunnels," he murmured, consulting his architectural plans. These passages connected the great houses of Belgravia, allowing discreet movement without disturbing the social activities above ground. Inspector Lestrade arrived as Holmes prepared to descend, the inspector's expression reflecting considerable skepticism about underground adventures. "Surely this is work for my constables, Mr. Holmes, if this Der Schatten is as dangerous as Mr. Thornfield suggests." "Precisely why conventional methods will prove inadequate," Holmes interrupted, checking his chemical satchel. "Our quarry possesses intimate knowledge of these passages and considerable skill in eliminating unwelcome visitors." We descended into the passage, Holmes leading with fluid grace, his torch beam dancing across brick walls that showed clear signs of recent traffic. The tunnel extended perhaps 50 yards before opening into a wider chamber, its construction speaking of the previous century's engineering. Fresh chalk marks upon the walls formed a sequence of symbols, survey notation applied by someone mapping these forgotten routes. The chamber had been converted into a sophisticated temporary headquarters. Tables constructed from wooden planks supported maps of London, chemical apparatus for document forgery, and most disturbing of all, detailed surveillance photographs of government officials. Holmes examined these with intense interest, his magnifying glass revealing the distinctive grain patterns of continental photographic processing. From a leather portfolio concealed beneath one of the tables, Holmes extracted correspondence in German script detailing recruitment operations and extraction procedures. Most chilling was a floor plan of Greystone Manor marked with precise timing notations. The mechanical disappearance had been rehearsed with military precision. "Sir Reginald was never intended to survive this operation," Holmes said grimly, studying a document outlining procedures for permanent disposal of compromised assets. Before I could respond, a low groan emanated from the chamber's shadows. Holmes swung his torch, illuminating a figure slumped against the wall. Sir Reginald Ashford, bound and gagged but alive. I rushed forward to attend him, quickly removing his restraints while Holmes maintained vigilant watch. "Holmes," Sir Reginald croaked, his eyes wide with terror and relief. "He knows everything. De Chatton discovered the documents were taken. He was coming back tonight to transport me to Hamburg." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his eyes scanning the chamber with renewed intensity. "And how, precisely, did he learn of this development?" The circle of knowledge was quite limited. At that moment, Mr. Thornfield appeared at the tunnel entrance, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of considerable haste. Most curious of all, I observed that the chemical stain upon his cuff had darkened considerably since our morning encounter. Holmes fixed our Colonial Office colleague with that penetrating stare which had unnerved countless subjects. "Mr. Thornfield, your timing proves most fortuitous. Tell me, when exactly did you last visit this chamber?" The question hung in the stale air like an accusation, and I saw Thornfield's hand move almost imperceptibly toward his coat pocket. Whatever revelations awaited us in this subterranean maze, I sensed we stood upon the threshold of truths that would illuminate not merely Sir Reginald's fate, but the intricate web of betrayal that had made his impossible vanishing seem so convincingly supernatural. The game had indeed taken a perilous turn, and the true nature of our adversary was about to be revealed in ways none of us had anticipated. The stale air of the underground chamber grew thick with unspoken accusations as Holmes fixed Thornfield with that penetrating stare which had unmasked countless criminals throughout his extraordinary career. The Colonial Office man's hand remained suspended near his coat pocket, his usually composed features betraying the first tremors of genuine alarm. Sir Reginald, freed from his bonds but still weak from his ordeal, watched this confrontation with growing comprehension and horror. "Your question requires careful consideration, Mr. Thornfield," Holmes said with deceptive gentleness, producing his magnifying glass to examine the chemical stain upon the man's cuff with scientific precision. "This oxalic acid discoloration has darkened considerably since our morning encounter. More significantly, it now shows traces of ferric oxalate, the distinctive residue left by continental photographic developing processes." Holmes moved with fluid grace toward the intelligence apparatus scattered throughout the chamber, his keen eyes noting details that escaped ordinary observation. "These German cameras, this chemical equipment, these surveillance photographs, all bear fingerprints that match the impressions I discovered on your cuff during our previous meetings." Thornfield's carefully maintained composure began to crack like ice under spring sunshine. "You're mistaken, Holmes. These stains could have originated from any number of sources during my investigation." "Could they?" Holmes interrupted, his voice carrying that silky tone I had learned to associate with impending revelation. "Then perhaps you can explain how your fingerprints appear throughout this chamber on equipment that has been in place for weeks, not hours." Before Thornfield could respond, Holmes had applied his aniline solution to a section of the photographic equipment, revealing clear fingerprint impressions that glowed purple under his torch beam. "The same distinctive whorl pattern, Mr. Thornfield. The same slight scar across the right index finger that I observed when you handled your teacup this morning. The transformation that overcame our Colonial Office colleague was as dramatic as any theatrical performance I had ever witnessed. The mild-mannered bureaucrat's mask slipped away, revealing features that had hardened into something cold and calculating. When he spoke again, his voice carried subtle Germanic inflections that had been carefully concealed during our previous encounters. "A most impressive deduction, Mr. Holmes," he said with chilling calm. "I confess I underestimated both your observational skills and your persistence. My network has operated under your very nose for 3 years, and you never so much as glanced in my direction." Sir Reginald gasped in recognition and betrayal. "Thornfield, you were my handler. You recruited me into this nightmare with threats about my gambling debts." "Klaus Richter," Holmes observed conversationally, as though discussing the weather rather than confronting a master spy. "Formerly of the Prussian Intelligence Service, currently operating as Der Schatten for parties interested in British colonial planning. The mechanical disappearance was expertly conceived, theatrical misdirection designed to suggest supernatural impossibility while concealing a very human extraction operation." Richter's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "The British mind craves rational explanation for seemingly irrational events, Mr. Holmes. By presenting an apparently impossible vanishing, we ensured that investigators would focus upon the supernatural mystery rather than seeking practical solutions through systematic analysis. Yet something went wrong with your carefully orchestrated plan," Holmes continued, his grey eyes never leaving his adversary's face. "The documents were recovered by young Thomas, your network was compromised, and you found yourself forced into increasingly desperate measures to maintain operational security. The footman proved less reliable than anticipated," Richter admitted with professional detachment. "His nervousness attracted attention we could not afford. When you began investigating the mechanical aspects rather than accepting our supernatural explanation, elimination became operationally necessary." Inspector Lestrade's voice suddenly echoed from the tunnel entrance, accompanied by the sound of multiple footsteps approaching through the underground passages. "Mr. Holmes, we've surrounded the building and posted men at every tunnel exit we could locate from those architectural plans." Richter's expression hardened with the desperate calculation of a cornered predator. "It appears our conversation must be abbreviated, gentlemen. Sir Reginald, you will accompany me through the Eastern Passage. Any attempt to interfere will result in immediate termination of all present parties." Holmes stepped forward with that peculiar fearlessness I had witnessed in countless dangerous situations throughout our partnership. "I think not, Herr Richter. You see, while you were explaining your operations with such characteristic Germanic thoroughness, Dr. Watson was quietly positioning himself behind that support pillar with his service revolver. At that moment, I emerged from concealment with my weapon trained upon our adversary, the years of military service having prepared me well for such tactical situations. The confined space of the chamber made accurate shooting virtually certain, and Richter's eyes widened as he recognized the hopelessness of his position. The German spy's hand moved toward his coat pocket with lightning speed, but not for the weapon Holmes had anticipated. Instead, he withdrew a small, dark vial whose contents glinted ominously in the torchlight. Before any of us could react, he brought it to his lips and swallowed its contents in a single, desperate motion. "Cyanide," I cried, rushing forward with my medical training engaged, but even as I knelt beside him, the bitter almond scent confirmed what I already knew. Richter's body convulsed with a violent seizure characteristic of prussic acid poisoning, his face contorting with a mixture of grim satisfaction and agonizing pain. Holmes stood over the fallen spy master with an expression of professional respect tinged by regret. He carried his final escape route with him, Watson, a true professional operative, prepared for every contingency, including capture and interrogation. As Lestrade and his constables poured into the chamber, I attempted what medical intervention I could, but the poison had done its lethal work with ruthless efficiency. Klaus Richter, the man who had called himself Thornfield, who had operated as Der Schatten in the very heart of British government, had chosen death over the revelation of his network's secrets. The mechanical disappearance was indeed expertly conceived, Holmes observed, as we examined the intelligence materials scattered throughout the chamber. Maps, photographs, correspondence, evidence of a spy network that had penetrated deep into multiple government departments through systematic recruitment of vulnerable officials. Sir Reginald, supported by Inspector Lestrade, cast a grateful but haunted glance toward my remarkable friend. "How can I ever thank you, Mr. Holmes? Without your intervention, I would have vanished as completely as Richter intended, permanently eliminated in Hamburg to protect his network's operational security. Holmes smiled with that mixture of intellectual satisfaction and philosophical detachment that marked the conclusion of his most challenging cases. The impossible, Sir Reginald, is merely the improbable wearing theatrical costume. Once we strip away the misdirection and examine the mechanical reality beneath, even the most sophisticated deception yields to methodical investigation guided by scientific principles. As we prepared to return to the surface, leaving Lestrade to coordinate the collection of intelligence materials that would occupy government analysts for months, I reflected upon the extraordinary chain of deduction that had transformed an apparently supernatural mystery into a very human story of espionage, betrayal, and ultimate justice. The fog was finally beginning to lift from London streets, and with it, the shadows that had concealed one of the most ingenious and dangerous criminal operations we had ever encountered. The game, as Holmes would say, was indeed concluded, though its consequences would echo through the corridors of Whitehall for years to come, serving as a grim reminder that the greatest threats to British security often wore the most respectable faces and operated with the most unassailable credentials. The stale air of the underground chamber grew thick with unspoken accusations as Holmes fixed Thornfield with that penetrating stare which had unmasked countless criminals throughout his extraordinary career. The Colonial Office man's hand remained suspended near his coat pocket, his usually composed features betraying the first tremors of genuine alarm. Sir Reginald, freed from his bonds but still weak from his ordeal, watched this confrontation with growing comprehension and horror. "Your question requires careful consideration, Mr. Thornfield," Holmes said with deceptive gentleness, producing his magnifying glass to examine the chemical stain upon the man's cuff with scientific precision. "This oxalic acid discoloration has darkened considerably since our morning encounter. More significantly, it now shows traces of ferric oxalate, the distinctive residue left by continental photographic developing processes." Holmes moved with fluid grace toward the intelligence apparatus scattered throughout the chamber, his keen eyes noting details that escaped ordinary observation. These German cameras, this chemical equipment, these surveillance photographs, all bear fingerprints that match the impressions I discovered on your cuff during our previous meetings. Thornfield's carefully maintained composure began to crack like ice under spring sunshine. "You're mistaken, Holmes. These stains could have originated from any number of sources during my investigation." "Could they?" Holmes interrupted, his voice carrying that silky tone I had learned to associate with impending revelation. "Then perhaps you can explain how your fingerprints appear throughout this chamber on equipment that has been in place for weeks, not hours." Before Thornfield could respond, Holmes had applied his aniline solution to a section of the photographic equipment, revealing clear fingerprint impressions that glowed purple under his torch beam. "The same distinctive whirl pattern, Mr. Thornfield. The same slight scar across the right index finger that I observed when you handled your teacup this morning." The transformation that overcame our Colonial Office colleague was as dramatic as any theatrical performance I had ever witnessed. The mild-mannered bureaucrat's mask slipped away, revealing features that had hardened into something cold and calculating. When he spoke again, his voice carried subtle Germanic inflections that had been carefully concealed during our previous encounters. "A most impressive deduction, Mr. Holmes," he said with chilling calm. "I confess I underestimated both your observational skills and your persistence. My network has operated under your very nose for 3 years, and you never so much as glanced in my direction." Sir Reginald gasped in recognition and betrayal. "Thornfield, you were my handler. You recruited me into this nightmare with threats about my gambling debts." "Klaus Richter," Holmes observed conversationally, as though discussing the weather rather than confronting a master spy. "Formerly of the Prussian Intelligence Service, currently operating as Der Schatten for parties interested in British colonial planning. The mechanical disappearance was expertly conceived. Theatrical misdirection designed to suggest supernatural impossibility while concealing a very human extraction operation. Richter's smile held no warmth whatsoever. The British mind craves rational explanation for seemingly irrational events, Mr. Holmes. By presenting an apparently impossible vanishing, we ensured that investigators would focus upon the supernatural mystery rather than seeking practical solutions through systematic analysis. Yet something went wrong with your carefully orchestrated plan, Holmes continued, his grey eyes never leaving his adversary's face. The documents were recovered by young Thomas. Your network was compromised, and you found yourself forced into increasingly desperate measures to maintain operational security. The footman proved less reliable than anticipated, Richter admitted with professional detachment. His nervousness attracted attention we could not afford. When you began investigating the mechanical aspects rather than accepting our supernatural explanation, elimination became operationally necessary. Inspector Lestrade's voice suddenly echoed from the tunnel entrance, accompanied by the sound of multiple footsteps approaching through the underground passages. "Mr. Holmes, we've surrounded the building and posted men at every tunnel exit we could locate from those architectural plans." Richter's expression hardened with the desperate calculation of a cornered predator. "It appears our conversation must be abbreviated, gentlemen. Sir Reginald, you will accompany me through the Eastern Passage. Any attempt to interfere will result in immediate termination of all present parties." Holmes stepped forward with that peculiar fearlessness I had witnessed in countless dangerous situations throughout our partnership. "I think not, Herr Richter. You see, while you were explaining your operations with such characteristic Germanic thoroughness, Dr. Watson was quietly positioning himself behind that support pillar with his service revolver. At that moment, I emerged from concealment with my weapon trained upon our adversary, the years of military service having prepared me well for such tactical situations. The confined space of the chamber made accurate shooting virtually certain, and Richter's eyes widened as he recognized the hopelessness of his position. The German spy's hand moved toward his coat pocket with lightning speed, but not for the weapon Holmes had anticipated. Instead, he withdrew a small, dark vial whose contents glinted ominously in the torchlight. Before any of us could react, he brought it to his lips and swallowed its contents in a single, desperate motion. "Cyanide!" I cried, rushing forward with my medical training engaged, but even as I knelt beside him, the bitter almond scent confirmed what I already knew. Richter's body convulsed with the violent seizure characteristic of prussic acid poisoning, his face contorting with a mixture of grim satisfaction and agonizing pain. Holmes stood over the fallen spy master with an expression of professional respect, tinged by regret. "He carried his final escape route with him, Watson. A true professional operative, prepared for every contingency, including capture and interrogation." As Lestrade and his constables poured into the chamber, I attempted what medical intervention I could, but the poison had done its lethal work with ruthless efficiency. Klaus Richter, the man who had called himself Thornfield, who had operated as Der Schatten in the very heart of British government, had chosen death over the revelation of his network's secrets. The mechanical disappearance was indeed expertly conceived, Holmes observed, as we examined the intelligence materials scattered throughout the chamber. Maps, photographs, correspondence, evidence of a spy network that had penetrated deep into multiple government departments through systematic recruitment of vulnerable officials. Sir Reginald, supported by Inspector Lestrade, cast a grateful but haunted glance toward my remarkable friend. "How can I ever thank you, Mr. Holmes? Without your intervention, I would have vanished as completely as Richter intended, permanently eliminated in Hamburg to protect his network's operational security." Holmes smiled with that mixture of intellectual satisfaction and philosophical detachment that marked the conclusion of his most challenging cases. "The impossible, Sir Reginald, is merely the improbable wearing theatrical costume. Once we strip away the misdirection and examine the mechanical reality beneath, Even the most sophisticated deception yields to methodical investigation guided by scientific principles. As we prepared to return to the surface, leaving Lestrade to coordinate the collection of intelligence materials that would occupy government analysts for months, I reflected upon the extraordinary chain of deduction that had transformed an apparently supernatural mystery into a very human story of espionage, betrayal, and ultimate justice. The fog was finally beginning to lift from London streets, and with it, the shadows that had concealed one of the most ingenious and dangerous criminal operations we had ever encountered. The game, as Holmes would say, was indeed concluded, though its consequences would echo through the corridors of Whitehall for years to come, serving as a grim reminder that the greatest threats to British security often wore the most respectable faces and operated with the most unassailable credentials. The morning light filtered through the windows of Greystone Manor's drawing room, illuminating a scene vastly different from the supernatural mystery that had gripped London's imagination mere days before. Holmes stood in the notorious corridor, his keen grey eyes surveying the mechanical marvel that had created such convincing impossibility. Inspector Lestrade, Sir Reginald, and Lady Whitmore gathered around him as he prepared to deliver the methodical explanation that would transform theatrical magic into scientific reality. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice carrying that characteristic blend of intellectual satisfaction and professional precision. "You witnessed not supernatural phenomenon, but mechanical ingenuity of the highest order. Observe this third gas fixture. Its spacing differs by precisely 1 inch from its companions, a discrepancy invisible to casual observation, yet crucial to the entire apparatus." He manipulated the brass mounting with practiced skill, demonstrating how the fixture served as both illumination and trigger mechanism. When rotated to this specific position, gas pressure decreases, activating a counterweight system concealed within the walls. This reduction triggers the release of a hidden panel, expertly crafted by Miggins to match the existing oak grain through careful application of oxalic acid and selective staining. The panel swung inward with silent precision, revealing the compartment that had briefly concealed Sir Reginald during his impossible vanishing. Holmes produced his measuring tape, indicating the exact dimensions that had made the illusion possible. The compartment measures 9 inches in depth, precisely the discrepancy between the corridor's apparent 30-foot length and the architectural plans showing 29 feet 3 inches. A man walking at normal pace reaches this point, where the panel, moving inward on well-oiled hinges, receives him between footsteps. The Axminster runner conceals the floor joint, while the mechanical timing ensures the vanishing occurs in the space of a single stride. He knelt to demonstrate the secondary mechanism, the hinged baseboard that provided access to the forgotten service tunnels. From concealment to extraction required mere seconds. These passages, dating from the manor's original construction, connected Belgravia's great houses for discreet service access. Richter's research had identified and mapped this forgotten infrastructure, creating escape routes invisible to conventional investigation. Sir Reginald stepped forward, his face bearing the weight of recent revelations. "Mr. Holmes, I must express my profound gratitude for your intervention. Had you not unraveled Richter's deception, I would have vanished permanently, eliminated in Hamburg to protect his network's security." Holmes acknowledged this with characteristic understatement. "The mechanical elements were expertly conceived, Sir Reginald, but they relied upon a fundamental weakness, the mind's reluctance to accept mundane explanations for apparently miraculous events. By presenting an impossible vanishing, Richter ensured that investigators would pursue supernatural theories rather than examining practical mechanics." Lady Whitmore moved closer to inspect the revealed mechanism, her expression mixing fascination with residual unease. "To think that my own home was transformed into such an elaborate stage for international espionage. Will the manor ever feel secure again?" "Indeed it shall," Holmes replied with gentle assurance. "The mechanical components will be removed, the tunnels sealed, and your corridor restored to its original elegant simplicity. The supernatural mystery will fade from public memory, replaced by appreciation for your gracious hospitality." Inspector Lestrade consulted his notebook with professional satisfaction. The intelligence materials recovered from Richter's underground headquarters have revealed the scope of his network, dozens of compromised officials across multiple government departments. The Foreign Office estimates that his operations had been active for nearly 3 years. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out upon London's streets where the perpetual fog was finally beginning to lift. Richter possessed the patience of a master strategist, building his network through careful, psychological manipulation rather than crude coercion. Each asset believed himself isolated, unaware of the larger apparatus he served. The morning progressed with systematic dismantling of the mechanical components, each piece revealing the extraordinary craftsmanship that had made the impossible seem routine. As workers removed the counterweight system and sealed the hidden passages, Holmes reflected upon the case's broader implications. The theatrical disappearance succeeded because it exploited our fundamental assumptions about reality, he observed to me as we prepared to depart. Richter understood that the human mind craves rational explanation for irrational events, yet paradoxically rejects mundane solutions to apparently miraculous problems. As our hansom cab carried us back toward Baker Street, I reflected upon the extraordinary chain of deduction that had transformed supernatural mystery into human drama. The fog continued to dissipate, revealing London's familiar architecture beneath the yellow veil that had concealed so many secrets. "Another triumph of method over mystification," I remarked to my remarkable friend. Holmes smiled with that mixture of intellectual satisfaction and philosophical detachment that marked his greatest victories. "The impossible, Watson, is merely the improbable wearing dramatic costume. Strip away the theatrical elements, apply systematic observation, and even the most sophisticated deception yields to scientific investigation." The case was closed, justice served, yet shadows remained, reminders that the game between order and chaos, truth and deception, continues eternally in London's hidden corners, awaiting the next challenge to extraordinary minds dedicated to illuminating darkness with reason's brilliant light. The December morning brought crisp clarity to London's streets, the oppressive November fog having finally lifted to reveal the familiar architecture of our great metropolis in sharp relief. I found Holmes in our sitting room, not with the violin that had marked his periods of intellectual restlessness, but seated in contemplative silence before the fire, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. The morning papers lay scattered about him, their headlines proclaiming the arrest of government clerks and the exposure of what the press had dubbed the Belgravia spy ring. "Watson," he said without turning from his meditation, "you are wondering about the broader implications of our recent adventure. The mechanical disappearance at Greystone Manor was merely the visible tip of an iceberg whose true dimensions we are only now beginning to comprehend." I settled into my customary chair, noting the official correspondence that bore the seals of various government departments. "The investigation continues to expand, I take it." Indeed, Richter's network extended far beyond simple document theft. The Foreign Office has uncovered evidence of systematic intelligence gathering, shipping manifests, industrial surveys, even surveillance of private citizens whose activities might prove relevant to German interests. Holmes reached for his pipe, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. The Colonial Office documents were merely one thread in a web that encompassed economic warfare, military intelligence, and colonial competition. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Sir Reginald Ashford, whose appearance had undergone considerable transformation since our underground encounter. The haunted expression had faded from his features, replaced by something approaching his former dignity, though traces of his ordeal remained visible to the observant eye. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said as he accepted our hospitality, "I come to express my gratitude and to share news that may interest you. The Colonial Office has completed its investigation, and I am pleased to report complete exoneration of any treasonous intent." Holmes leaned forward with characteristic attention. "The coercion was evident from the beginning, Sir Reginald. Richter's genius lay not in crude blackmail, but in psychological manipulation that made his victims believe they were orchestrating their own salvation." Sir Reginald nodded gravely. He preyed upon my financial vulnerabilities with surgical precision, making me believe I was merely escaping creditors when in fact I was walking directly into his extraction operation. The missing documents, the staged urgency, all designed to give me plausible motivation for participating in my own disappearance. "The true masterpiece," Holmes observed, drawing thoughtfully on his pipe, "was the psychological misdirection that accompanied the mechanical illusion. By creating an apparently supernatural vanishing, Richter ensured that investigators would pursue mystical explanations rather than examining practical mechanics. Even Scotland Yard, for all their experience, found themselves chasing phantoms. Inspector Lestrade arrived as if summoned by this observation, his expression bearing the satisfaction of a man whose methodical work had finally borne fruit. "Mr. Holmes, the Europa Coffee House has yielded a treasure trove of intelligence. Richter's operation was far more extensive than we initially suspected. Comprehensive preparation for what appears to be anticipated conflict between German and British interests." Holmes rose and moved to our window, gazing out upon Baker Street with that peculiar intensity I had observed countless times when his mind was processing complex implications. "A patient strategist indeed, Inspector. Building networks, gathering intelligence, preparing for confrontations that might not materialize for years to come." "And young Thomas?" I inquired, remembering the terrified footman whose unwitting participation had nearly cost him his freedom. "Suspended sentence and removal to relatives in the Midlands," Lestrade replied with evident satisfaction. "Mr. Holmes's intervention secured him leniency. The lad genuinely believed himself involved in nothing more serious than discreet message-carrying." Holmes turned from the window with that enigmatic smile I had learned to associate with cases that had revealed deeper truths than their surface mysteries suggested. Thomas was merely an instrument that trembled in the hand that used it. The true villain possessed the patience to construct his deception over months, positioning each element with mathematical precision. "The oxalic acid stain upon Richter's cuff," I said, suddenly understanding. "That was your first concrete evidence of his involvement with the mechanical apparatus." Combined with the faint scent of photographic developing chemicals and his uncanny ability to arrive at each crucial moment with precisely the right information, Holmes confirmed. "A civil servant learns to avoid leaving traces, yet Richter carried his laboratory with him. It was the timing of a man that condemned him as surely as his fingerprints." As our visitors prepared to depart, Sir Reginald paused at the door with evident emotion. "Mr. Holmes, without your extraordinary methods, I would have vanished as completely as Richter intended, eliminated in Hamburg to protect his network's operational security." Holmes acknowledged this with characteristic understatement. "The impossible, Sir Reginald, is merely the improbable wearing theatrical costume. Strip away the misdirection, apply systematic observation, and even the most sophisticated deception yields to scientific investigation." After they had gone, I reflected upon the extraordinary case that had begun with supernatural mystery and concluded with revelations about international espionage of unprecedented scope. "Another triumph of method over mystification," I observed. Holmes settled back into his chair, his grey eyes reflecting both intellectual satisfaction and philosophical concern. "Indeed, Watson, but this triumph illuminates shadows that extend far beyond elegant drawing rooms and mechanical contrivances. The game between nations has begun in earnest, and I fear we have witnessed merely the opening moves in a contest that will test everything we hold dear." He reached for the morning correspondence, its official seals speaking of continuing consultations with government departments. The mechanical disappearance served its purpose admirably. creating mystical confusion while concealing very human treachery. Yet the true lesson lies not in Richter's ingenuity, but in our own tendency to seek the extraordinary when faced with the inexplicable. The fire crackled softly in the grate as Holmes returned to his contemplation, and I sensed that while this particular case had reached its conclusion, its implications would continue to resonate through the corridors of power for years to come. The fog had lifted from London's streets, but the shadows of international intrigue promised new challenges for minds dedicated to illuminating darkness with reason's persistent light. The bell below rang sharply, announcing another visitor to our familiar lodgings. Holmes reached for his coat with that familiar gleam in his eyes that spoke of fresh mysteries awaiting solution. "Come, Watson," he said with renewed energy. "The game, as they say, is always afoot."